Hi guys, I want to do a quick overview of some of the chapter 44 stuff on populations. But before I did that, I wanted to just kind of highlight kind of this ecology unit and kind of an overview of basically biology or life. And so what you see here, this weird it's kind of a memory trick I used to use for how to study living things and how they're organized from smallest to largest kind of groupings. Okay, so we can study biology kind of at these smaller levels and then the larger levels. And so you'll notice atom, it's a mactosopisia. So we have atoms, which is not a living thing by itself, molecules, but all of these kind of build on each other. So you put a bunch of atoms together and you get a molecule. You put a bunch of molecules together and you can build the small organelles, which are the parts of a cell. Like, an example of molecule would be H2O. An example of an atom is just an oxygen atom by itself. An example of an organelle is like a mitochondria, in the cell. And I think everybody knows what a cell is. You put all the organelles together and that gives you a cell. You put a bunch of cells together and you can get a tissue. Okay, so a tissue is cells of the same type. Okay, that's what a tissue is. So a group of muscle cells is muscle tissue. A group of nerve cells is nerve tissue. Then you can put a bunch of different tissues together and, I'm going to say a bunch of different tissues together can give you an organ. So, for example, your stomach is an organ and it has muscle tissue, it has nerve tissue, it has connective tissue, it has different kinds of tissue. So that's an organ. You put a bunch of organs together, working together, and we call that a system. Like an example would be like the digestive system. Right, our organ example was stomach. So the digestive system is the stomach, the small intestine, the large intestine, the liver, and all those working together. Okay, and if you put all the systems together, you get an organism. Now this would be a multicellular organism, like a human. Okay, not like a bacteria. So let's make one distinction here. If we're talking about living, this could be a living thing. It could end there if we're talking about a unicellular organism. Like an example would be like a bacteria cell. Like a bacteria cell is the organism, okay? So that's a unicellular organism. This one here that we're talking about, this kind of organism would be something like a human or any multicellular organism, Okay. Now, here you can see now moving up then, we go into a bunch of organisms together give us a population. So here is what we are studying right now. Okay, so chapter 44, chapter 45, and chapter 46 are going to be on populations, communities, and ecosystems. So you see they're kind of building on each other. They're getting into bigger and bigger organization. Okay, so a population, I have it defined down here, so you can kind of see. You guys can stop and screenshot or whatever. A population, which this is going to be chapter 44 that we're doing right now, is about populations. Then communities was chapter 45. Ecosystems is chapter 46. And we're going to see that they kind of build. Okay, a population is a group of the organisms of the same kind, same species, living in the same place at the same time. So, an example would be if I'm studying just the squirrels in a forest, a particular area. And I'm going to be looking at their population growth curves and things that affect their population size, etc. That's what we're going to do here. A community would be then all the populations. Again, we can keep like building up here. All the populations together give you a community. So it's, we're going to look at if I'm studying all the living things in the forest and how they interact. Okay, so not just the squirrels, but the squirrels and the trees and the bugs and all the things and all the kind of interactions they might have. Predator-prey interactions, symbioses, like working together. And we'll do that in chapter 45. And then building on that, on chapter 46, an ecosystem is the community. So it's all the living things, which we refer to as biotic factors, and the non-living things, abiotic factors. So an example of an abiotic factor is like, water, the air quality, the rocks. And so in an ecosystem, when we're studying an ecosystem, we're going to study basically all the living things that live in an area, which is the community, and how the non-living things affect it. So how things like pollution and water, and we'll look at the cycles, nitrogen cycle, carbon cycle, how it cycles in and out of the living community. So that kind of gives us kind of an overview of this unit, this ecology unit. This, I'm just going to kind of go through chapter 44, which is just populations. Hi. So I just defined a population. That's the definition of it. I'm going to kind of go through this quickly and only explain things I think need explaining. Why would we want to know population size? This is just in some real life examples of why you might want to estimate the size of a population, which is what we're about to do in a second. So when they're studying endangered species, a lot of times they want to know where the population number is. If you're the gaming warden and you're determining how many deer people can kill each year or how many fish they can get out of a lake each year, you're kind of monitoring the population growth curves of these species to determine what's safe so it doesn't go extinct. If you're studying, pest control, you're studying the population of mice or mosquitoes or any other kind of pests that we're dealing with that are eating gypsy moths, that are eating our trees, etc. So that's just an example. You can look at an example in the book there about the Canada goose, how they're studying the population of that. That's an example of an invasive species, which we'll get into in chapter 45, I believe, more. So we're just talking about a population of one group. So it first talks about, how would you estimate the population size? Let's talk about that first. And it gave you two ways to do that, what we call quadrant sampling or random sampling, and mark and recapture. And this is pretty self-explanatory, I think, when you would use one or the other. Quadrant sampling, where you're just taking the quadrant, you go out and divide with like string or something it into quadrants, and then you count like how many things like dandelions or something are in certain quadrants, and then you can estimate from that. But you can see how that would not work if you had a mobile animal. Okay, like you couldn't do it if you're doing like squirrels and they're running around and moving from quadrant to quadrant. So whenever you're dealing with animals that are moving around, we do the mark and recapture. Okay, this would be if I was doing plants or dandelions or whatever. And I gave you several examples in the summer packet on how to do a mark and recapture and how to do a quadrant sampling. So I'm going to assume most people are getting these right on the thing, so I'm not going to go over it unless you need help. But you should be able to do one of each. So that's how you estimate the population size. Sometimes we study the population density, which is just the number of individuals per area. Sometimes they just record it that way instead of total population. Or sometimes we'll refer to as the biomass, especially when we're talking about plants. Instead of counting how many blades of grass, are in a certain area, they might take a certain quadrant, take the grass, dry it out, the dry weight without water, and kind of record sort of the population that way, kind of by biomass per unit area. So I'm not going to go through these. This was an example of the quadrant sampling, which is number 4 on your summer packet. So there's the answer. And this was an example, the mark and recaptures. Again, these were the ones, I'm not going to go over these. Here's the answers. You guys saw my answer key, and you come to me if you need help with those. All right. I want to get into number 11. From these yellow numbers, by the way, kind of should correspond with your summer packet numbers. But population, not just estimating their size, but another way to study populations is by looking at how they're spaced. So they're either one of 3. They're either randomly spaced, uniform, or clumped. This one is the most common, and we're going to see why. But you should know the conditions here that would lead to why a particular species or population would be spaced randomly versus uniformly. And it has to do with kind of the environmental conditions. Are the resources spread evenly? Like, is there water everywhere? Or is there a pond where, well, that would be clumped, but where everything's going to live around where there's a food source or where there's water? So you can see I kind of highlighted in red if you're comparing the environmental conditions. The environmental conditions have to be uniform to have random or uniform spacing, meaning like if things are going to just be random in the environment, there has to be equal food, light, if we're talking about plants, food, light, water, whatever. So if I give you a condition and I say that the environmental conditions are uniform, it could be one of those two. If I said to you the environmental conditions are not uniform, that's what's going to lead to clumping, okay? Or they're going to live near a water source or a food source, etc. You can see also competition plays a role. Competition, remember, intra-specific competition means competition within the species, so like squirrels competing with squirrels. And that's what we're talking about here, just one population of the same species. If there's no competition, you can have random spacing. If there's intense competition between the members of the species, that's what's going to make them space uniformly. Okay? Then we'll also see clumped, because in animal behavior, a lot of animals have colonies or schools or they have social groups, and that's why they end up in clumped. Okay? Again, here's the difference between intra-specific competition and inter. Okay, this is inter means between. So this would be like between like squirrels competing with finches for the same food source. And this is just the squirrels competing with each other for food. And we'll see both play a role. I then have examples here that you can read through in the notes, but I give examples of each of the types of spacing. Dandelion seeds are spread randomly in your yard. That's an example of random spacing but only if like the environment is uniform, there's no competition, which there isn't between dandelions. And there's no tendency to clump. They have no reason. They're not like geese that like have a flock. Here's an example of uniform spacing. This bush that lives in the desert, if you look at them, you'll see they're spaced uniformly, and that's because there's intense competition amongst these plants with each other, okay? And so the roots actually give off sort of kind of like a thing to prevent growth in an area around it of other plants. So they end up being spaced kind of uniformly. That's probably the rarest. This one is probably the most rare of the three types of spacing. Oh, I didn't mean to do that. All right. The most common spacing that we see is clumping for a lot of reasons. Usually resources are not evenly distributed. There's water or light or food or shade or nesting sites or something in one particular area. So they tend to clump where there's things that they need. Reproduction is also easier in groups. So some species have evolved to live closer together in clumps because we're going to see evolution is all about reproduction. Everything's about reproduction. Also, groups can better ward off predators. Okay, sometimes, so that's an example. Here's another example in plants of why clumping might be more common. So asexual reproduction, which is like when sometimes we call it one-parent reproduction, meaning it's not sexual like our humans. You have to have a male and a female. You have to have gametes, a sperm and an egg, fertilize. Asexual is when like a strawberry plant can reproduce all by itself. It just grows a thing called a runner, right, which is right here. And then that grows new roots and a new plant. And then it grows a runner, new root. So things that reproduce asexually tend to end up being clumps just because of their method of reproduction. Then I'm going to have you guys can read through this. Again, still talking about clumping. There's advantages and disadvantages to clumping, which you can see here. This is talking about for trees or plants. Obviously, if clumping occurs, the advantages must outweigh the disadvantages, because evolution, if it's evolved for them to live together clumped, then that's must outweigh the other. Okay, so you can just read there some advantages and disadvantages of clumping for trees. Here's some examples of for animals that live in social groups, which is clumping, some advantages and disadvantages. And again, obviously, one might outweigh the other. The advantages would have to be better for the survival, or weighted heavier in their survival than the disadvantages for it to evolve. I'm going to assume you guys can read those. Age structure diagrams, these were talked about in numbers 13, 15, and 16, and they're basically just a way to look at a population. We often do it with humans. You'll see most of the time when we give an example of this, we're talking about humans in different countries, where they divide it into 3 categories, like the 0 to 14, that's what we call our pre-reproductive, okay, before puberty, before they can reproduce. Here's where they can reproduce, and then the post-reproductive age, like once women have reached menopause and can't reproduce anymore. And so you can see in these type of countries, there's a lot of younger people, less older people than in the United States, where it tends to be more equal. Okay. So what you need to know is if there's more pre-reproductive, if the bottom number category, like the younger people, is higher, then think about the future of that population is going to tend to increase more in the future. Okay. If you saw this flipped upside down, where most of the people in a population were old, and it went like that, you had very few young people, then in the future, when the old people die, obviously the population would decrease. Okay. So that's those. All right. So let's look at things that can cause populations to increase or decrease. These are pretty self-explanatory. Natality is a fancy word for births. Obviously, if a lot of people are born, that's going to increase. And immigration is people coming in to an area from another area. That's going to increase the population in an area. Whereas deaths and people leaving emigration would decrease it. Okay. So if we set aside, sometimes it doesn't include immigration and emigration, and we just consider like the birth rate and the death rate. And that's often when we're calculating like the growth rate using our equations, which we'll do in a little bit. They don't factor in immigration and emigration. We're often just talking about births and deaths. But everybody can see these are all just different ways to define zero population growth, okay? And this is kind of confusing. A lot of people think zero means like there's nobody, okay? Zero means it's not increasing and it's not decreasing, okay? So it would be when the line on a population growth curve is straight across. It's not going up, it's not going down, okay? So if births were equal to deaths, it basically means population is staying the same. If there's 100 people, it's 100 people, it's 100 people, it's 100 people, it's 100 people, year after year. Okay. And so that's, in general, what zero population growth means. It means it's not increasing or decreasing. And that would, we haven't really got into this yet, but that's going to be also happen when n, which is your population number, equals k, which is the carrying capacity, which we see all ecosystems, all areas have kind of a maximum. It's called the carrying capacity, denoted with a k. And so the population can only grow exponentially for a certain period of time, and then it starts slowing down when it gets close to the carrying capacity, and then it levels out into zero population growth. Okay. All right, so we're going to learn two types of growth curves. I'm going to do more with these equations and how to use them in class. But just in general, you should know kind of the two types. I had you draw both of these over the summer, an exponential growth curve and a logistic growth curve. This is also sometimes called an S-shaped growth curve because it looks like an S. This one is hypothetical. Okay, so exponential growth can't happen forever. It can happen. You'll see here this red part of the logistic growth curve is exponential growth. Like all populations just naturally start growing exponentially. But they can't grow like over here. This is implying exponential growth forever. This can't happen because there's going to be a carrying capacity, meaning there's going to be limiting factors that eventually limit how many things can live in that area. So we kind of study exponential growth. It's like our baseline, meaning that if we were in this perfect world, a Shangri-La, where there was no limiting factors of any sort, there's going to be unlimited food, space, water, light, whatever the living thing needs, okay? Then this is just how, based on numbers, what would happen? You would have exponential growth. And this is going to be the equation we'll go through for exponential growth. Basically, it's delta. Remember, D stands for, that's how AP writes delta. It's basically the change in number over time, which is, sometimes we're going to refer to this as the growth or the increase equals R times N. But that's how it's written on the AP equation sheet. And so we're going to see R is the rate of increase, and then N is the population number, and we're going to learn how to plug things in and kind of plot that. But for now, I just want you to know exponential growth is hypothetical, but this is what populations would do if there were no limiting factors. What ends up happening, though, is, all have the tendency, kind of have a intrinsic rate of increase to grow exponentially at a certain rate. But then this is more what starts to happen. It grows exponentially, and then it starts getting slowed down. So up here, I don't know, this picture doesn't even have it. That dotted line is the carrying capacity. And so you can see that as we approach, and this would over here, population size, that would be N. As we approach and get closer and closer to N, we see, so we have an acceleration. It starts to slow. Now we're starting to slow down. It's still increasing. The population is still increasing in size, but it's increasing at a slower rate and a slower increase, and eventually it reaches the carrying capacity where it will have zero population growth, meaning it's not increasing or decreasing. It's pretty much staying the same. Okay, and that is going to be the equation for logistic growth curve. This is a more realistic what happens in real kind of ecosystems. There's always a limit. There's things that are going to determine this K here, lots of things. How much food, how much space, how much nesting sites there are, if it's a bird, etc. This is the equation. Again, it's just delta. It's the same exact equation as the exponential growth curve. The only difference is that we see, so it's basically exponential growth, but we're going to see the carrying capacity. This part is going to be why it slows down as it gets closer to K. And we'll go through how to use the equations and calculate things later. I just want you to know the two basic kinds. All right, so the limiting factors we talked about, these are things that will limit the population growth. There are two kinds, density dependent, density independent. I think that's pretty easy to understand from the notes and the homework over the summer packet. Density dependent, just think of it, it depends on how big the population is, on the density. So as a population is getting closer to K, or bigger, closer to the carrying capacity, these are things that will start to play a role, but they don't play a role at the beginning. And so, like, if we're looking back up here at this growth curve here, down here in the red area, when there's probably the density dependent limiting factors, like how much food there is, how much water there is, isn't playing a role because we're not near the carrying capacity. But as this approaches and gets closer to K, this is when the density dependent ones start kind of slowing this down and making it zero out at zero population growth. So these things are things that only play a role as the population gets crowded. Density independent, meaning these are things that can make populations, limit populations or make them decrease, but has nothing to do with whether the population's big or small. It's just kind of random things, like a flood comes through and wipes out a bunch of people. A fire comes through and burns half the forest. So these are things that can control a population, but they're just kind of random events and they happen whenever. They're independent of the density of the population. All right, so the exponential growth curve, I kind of talked about this already. Oh, by the way, this is also called the J-shaped growth curve because it looks like a J. This is what would happen if there were no predators, no parasites, nobody's competing, there's plenty of food, nobody's coming in, nobody's coming out. There's unlimited resources. So this is like, again, the hypothetical Shangri-La. But we use it as a baseline. And just for example, all populations have the potential to grow exponentially. An example, I'm going to talk about like fruit flies versus elephants here. Fruit flies and elephants, they have different rates of increase, but we're going to see both would eventually show an exponential growth curve, even though one might show an exponential growth curve, but just with a lower rate. So in this one, if I have 2 fruit flies in April, then if they have unlimited place to grow and food and whatever, just based on exponential growth, you'll have that many fruit flies by August. That's in 4 months. So we can take our fruit flies and keep them. In 4 months from now, we could have that many, but we won't because they're going to run out of space in that little jar. But that's theoretically what could happen. It won't. Elephants, which reproduce very differently, they're very slow. So look about fruit flies. The life, every 2 weeks you get kind of a new generation. So they lay eggs, they turn into larvae, which crawl up and turn little pupa, which is like a little cocoon, and then they hatch and you have new flies in 2 weeks, and then the whole lifespan starts over. So 2 weeks is like the generation time, and fruit flies lay thousands and thousands of eggs. They lay tons of eggs at a time. So we're going to see they have a very high rate of reproduction, which we call the biotic potential. Elephants, which are the slowest breeding things on the earth, I think they're pregnant for like 2 years. Like a female elephant, the gestation time is 2 years. They're pregnant for 2 years and then they give birth to like 1 elephant, and then that's probably all they ever do in their lifetime. So you can see that, the rate of increase for fruit flies versus elephants will be different. But my point is, they will both eventually, they would grow exponentially just if they could, if there was no limiting resources, which there is. So this is showing you, kind of what I just drew on there. So what we call the biotic potential, or the intrinsic rate of increase, or the R max, all 3 of these things that I just highlighted are the same thing. So make sure you know all those terms. If I use them, they're all talking about the same thing, and they're basically talking about everything about how the organism reproduces. What's the rate of increase going to be, which is R. So different species, different populations, it's basically different species, have different rates of increase, which is R. So consider what I just said, how our fruit fly reproduces compared to an elephant. Fruit flies lay thousands of eggs every 2 weeks, and every 2 weeks you have a new generation with thousands of more. So their rate of increase is going to be much higher. Elephants give birth to 1 elephant after 2 years. So we would say that fruit flies have a higher biotic potential, or a higher intrinsic rate of increase, or a higher R max, just based on how they reproduce, okay? So which one over here, which curve would be elephants, which curve would be fruit flies? You see they're both exponential growth, but one has a higher R, one has a faster rate, just based on how it reproduces. So which one would be the fruit flies and which one would be the elephants? If you want to pause and think about it, you can. But this one would be the fruit flies. And I don't know, these elephants might be, I'm just these aren't actual fruit fly and elephants. I'm just saying I just found two with different rates. This would be the faster rate because the R is 1 and this R is 0.5. But again, everything will grow exponentially just at different rates depending on their biotic potential, how they reproduce. So this is just explaining kind of the same thing, but labeling the curves, all right? That just defines biotic potential. Again, Rmax, intrinsic rate of increase, biotic potential are all the same thing. And it's basically the maximum growth rate if everything were perfect, which never happens. These are some of the things that would affect biotic potential. The example I just gave you, I was talking about fruit flies. Just think of fruit flies versus elephants as kind of a different biotic potential. So how many offspring are produced at once? How many times does the organism reproduce in its lifetime? What's the generation time, etc. You can see fruit flies and elephants have very different methods here. All right, here's our definition of exponential growth, which I said, again, is not possible to maintain forever, but so when there's absolutely no limiting factors, which never happens, this is the definition. And I'm going to highlight it because right now it maybe doesn't make sense. But once we start calculating with the equation, I'm going to come back to it. So notice it says the population size will increase by the exact same proportion of its total, but not the same number every interval. And you're going to see, if you look at the example in your book of 44.4, it shows you, I think, mice. And you can see, like, in the first month, it increases by 800. The second month, it increases by 1120. The third month, it increases by 15. So that's the example of, like, they're not increasing by the same number every month, or if that's what we're using as our time interval, but they're increasing by the same rate. So in this one, I think the rate, if I remember, was 0.4 for the mice, and so n is the number. So you can see that they're increasing by 0.4 each time. Well, you're not going to see it yet. I'll go over that in class, so don't worry about that right now. Just kind of note that definition of exponential growth, and I'll worry about the equation in class. So to calculate exponential growth, I'm just going to teach you how to calculate R, right? Because here's our exponential growth curve equation, which is the change in the number over time, which we also refer to as just the growth sometimes. So these two things are the same. This is just how it's on the equation sheet for AP. But a lot of times I'll use this because it's easier to write. So it's the rate of increase, R, times the number of people in the population. Okay, so here's our R. So first you're going to have to calculate R. And R is the per capita growth rate, so meaning per head. So we're not going to take total births and total deaths. We're going to take the per capita birth rate and the per capita death rate. Okay, and then once we calculate this, we're going to plug this in to there, okay? But right now, I just want to show you how to calculate the per capita growth rate, all right? So how do we calculate R? So it's the per capita births minus the per capita deaths. So remember, per capita means per person. So let me show you. Here's an example here. So let's say there's 5,000 mice living in a field, and there's 1,000 mice born each month, and there's 250 mice that die each month. What's the per capita growth rate? Okay, so the per capita birth rate, remember, is how many births per person or per mice. And so that's going to equal, if you want to pause and try this yourself, you can. But there's 1,000 births each month, but you're dividing that by 1,000 because we want to know the birth rates per person or per mouse. And so that's going to equal 0.2. The death rate, the per capita death rate, there's 250 mice that die out of a total of 5,000 mice. So that's the per capita death rate. Okay, and then you just plug those in up here. So R equals 0.2 minus 0.05. So it equals, so our R value is going to be 0.15. That is for this particular population of mice, that's going to be the rate of increase that we're seeing. And we'll learn how to plug that into exponential growth curve next time. So I'm going to skip some of this here, but there's the solution again, neater. Don't worry about this yet. I mean, you can look ahead. If you want to look at this, you can, but I'm going to go over this in class with you. And I think that was all. So let me just show you a logistic growth curve here. Again, here's the equation. Remember, realistically, no population can grow exponentially forever. Density-dependent limiting factors will start to slow it down. And so you can see here, here's a exponential growth curve, but you can see that gets pushed, kind of shifted to the logistic growth curve, which is also called the sigmoid growth curve. That's also why we call it the S. See, this is what they do to make it confusing. Okay. So this is showing, so this equation up here goes with that one there. The logistic growth curve then has, we generally see, again, here's our population size over time. We generally see 3 phases. We call it the exponential phase initial, when there's not that many there, and there's not really limiting factors playing a role. And then the transitional stage is where it's kind of slows down. It's not exponential, it starts to slow down. It's still increasing, but it's slowing down, and then it eventually levels off, and the plateau stage is where you get 0 population growth. So I've kind of highlighted here the 3 phases and kind of what's happening in each for you to kind of read through, and I'll let you just do that on your own. You don't need to have me read it to you. Again, here you can see the 3 phases. I'm pointing out a couple other things on a logistic growth curve. So the green line here would be, let's say that's our carrying capacity. And we know it's there because it's going to be where the curve levels out. So the carrying capacity has to be right there. 0 population growth, which is when N, your number, equals K. That's another way of saying, that's 0 population growth. So when it levels out here. This point right here, right in the middle, as you're going up, is what we call the maximum sustained yield, or the inflection point, or sometimes they call it the K divided by 2 because it's half of the carrying capacity. So if this is my carrying capacity here, the inflection point is always half. It's K minus 2. All of those are the same thing. And this is often, so it's where population is half of its K. This is where the increase is its greatest because it's growing exponentially and increasing, and then here's where it's going to start slowing down. Okay, so this is where acceleration becomes deceleration. This is often the number that they use for managing animals and fish. Like a gaming warden, you don't want anything to get below the inflection point. If you're monitoring the population of, let's say, bass in a lake, you don't want it to drop below the inflection point, because if it gets down in here, you could have a density independent factor come along and wipe out everybody, and it could go extinct. It's too dangerous. Sometimes they can't recover. So they try to keep populations kind of, below the carrying capacity, because when it's up here, this is where things aren't getting enough food and things are dying. So a healthy population is sort of right at the inflection point and maybe a bit above. We don't want to go too far below. Okay. This is just defining carrying capacity, which I think everybody understands. It's kind of a natural line that we kind of find when we see where a population levels off. And it's determined by density-dependent limiting factors, okay? I think I'm going to end there. Now, the carrying capacity can change over time, and there's things that can cause it to go up or down, and all of that's listed there. And the rest of that I'm going to go through in class, okay? So I just want you to get that brief introduction. I think I asked you about survivorship curves, which are kind of at the end of the notes here. I'll kind of skip. We'll do all this in class. So the survivorship curves are another plot that we look at that are looking at who's surviving. How many people are surviving at different ages. So here's the age on the x-axis, and here's the number of survivors. And you can see there's 3 basic types, and some things are kind of in between. These are just kind of the 3 general kind of types. Type 1, think of it, type 1 is like humans, where when humans are born, they tend to, like, not many die in infancy or when they're young, and as we get older is when we start to die more. Okay, so most things are living to an old age and dying. So some populations have a type 1 survivorship curve. Some have a type 3 survivorship curve where a lot of things don't survive in the beginning and not very many things are making it into old age. Like Finding Nemo, right? The movie. The fish lays like gazillions of eggs and a lot of them get eaten by other fish or die. So most of the things are dying as eggs and very few are actually making it into adulthood. Okay, so you can see the reproductive strategies are different. Laying gazillions of eggs tends, there's a reason why. Whereas when we have a type 1 survivorship curve, we're not going to lay gazillions of babies. We don't lay, but whatever. And then type 2 is, there are some things where, like, there's an equal chance of it dying when it's an egg, when it's young, when it's middle-aged, when it's old. It's just kind of, you kind of have an equal rate of things dying. And I list some things here for each type, like some examples of animals that are found that have type 1, type 2, and type 3 survivorship curves. You can look that up. And I'm going to end there because we're getting kind of long. The rest